So my name is Eric Ting. I am the artistic director of California Shakespeare Theater, which is on unceded Ohlone territory in the Bay Area in the Orinda Hills. And this is our direct address program at Cal Shakes, and we're launching a new series this evening called Resisting Shakespeare. We'll get into that title here in a moment, but before we go any further, I've asked Madeline Sayet to offer an acknowledgement of where we are.
Kwai natiwis chokais, natiwis mohiksa kyokochi sochimunkus. Hey, I'm Maddie. I'm from the Mohegan tribe in Connecticut, where for the past 6 months I had been lucky enough to be quarantining in Connecticut, and Connecticut means place of the great tidal river. And during this quarantine, it was probably the first time that I got to actually spend time on the river regularly, listening to it, learning its ways, really understanding the river as the place that, you know, is actually how we're really meant to travel. And now for the first time in those 6 months, I've had to travel somewhere else. I'm now in Indiana on the lands of the Miami, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples. And it's just made me really aware of the difference between a place you know the stories of and a place that you don't. Even as a Native person, right? Like the way that I know the stories of Connecticut is so deep, and I don't know the stories of Indiana. And so rather than, you know, offer sort of formal land acknowledgement, I just wanted to offer a moment to reflect on how different our understanding of place would be if we really knew the stories under our feet, if we were exposed to the stories of the place that we're in nearly as much as we were exposed to Shakespeare. And to take time, I think especially now, is very important to really learn from the lessons of the land and the stories of the places that we're in, because it's so easy even now to be on Zoom all the time, to be far away, even when we're sitting in one place. And when better than now to actually find out the teachings of the place that we're in. It's not as poetic as it could be, but, you know, decolonization isn't always that straightforward. I could say something like, you know, more than that, but for right now, I think that's really all I really want, you know, is just for everyone to stop treating the land like it's not real, and Native peoples like we haven't been here the whole time. So just listen. Thanks.
Thank you, Madeline. So a few things. I always get a little nervous before public events, and one of the things that I'm really grateful for are folks like Norma and Jennifer, who are ASL interpreters tonight, who are always fond of reminding me to slow down, to catch my breath. So just a moment, and I'm going to go through some introductions, but to name in this space right here, right now, that we have suffered a loss today. In case there are some of you who don't know the news, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed earlier today. And I just want to say we're all kind of holding that right now. And I want to sort of invite that into this space, to not try and resist whatever that means for you. I myself am feeling an immense amount of anxiety and fear right now. But part of, I think, what we're here gathered to do this evening is to start a conversation. And it's a conversation that at Cal Shakes comes out of what has been a pretty long process. You know, what I've referred to as our accountability process of examining our role and our place in sustaining and perpetuating the conditions that have led us as a country to where we are right now. What I have found that has been so extraordinary about this is the opportunity in this moment to be able to craft community in such a way that is fundamentally in service of resilience. And I think like now in this moment, as much as any other moment prior to this, I feel the need, the profound need for just that. And so this is the invitation tonight. The invitation tonight is to think a little bit about this thing that we do, and for many of us, this thing that we love. This playwright, these plays, this canon. But I hope we go much further than that. Does that sound good? Okay. I'm going to start. So we've been doing these little introductions, name, pronouns, where you are, and we're asking for, we'll give you a brief visual description of what is in our particular video frame. I will begin. I said this earlier, my name is Eric Ting, he, him pronouns. I'm the artistic director of California Shakespeare Theater, which is on Chichenyo Ohlone land. But I'm actually zooming into you from West Virginia, my childhood home, which is on Osage Massillonic, unceded Osage Massillonic territory in the heart of Appalachia, which I understand to mean on the other side of the river.
Hi, good evening. I'm Dawn Monique Williams. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in today from Oakland, California, which is on Ohlone land.
Hey, I'm Maddie. My pronouns are she, her. I am calling in from Indiana, from the lands of the Miami, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples.
Hey y'all, I'm Sam. She, her, hers. I'm calling from my parents' living room. I don't go outside much. I think it's located in Detroit. I'm a caregiver, so I try not to engage with anybody outside of the two of them. I'm happy to be here.
I'll pass it on. Oh, you know, also visual description.
Oh, I'm sitting under a chandelier, surrounded by gray walls. There's a picture of the ocean over my shoulder, and I'll pass it to Marcus.
Good afternoon and good evening for some of you. My name is Marcus Gardley. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a poet playwright born and raised in the beautiful city of Oakland, California. And I am sitting in my office. I am in Los Angeles, and I'm sitting in my office, which is in my apartment, surrounded by all of my plays that I've ever had produced on a door, because it inspires me to keep moving forward.
Hi, I'm Nataki, Garrett, artistic director, Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I'm coming to the Zoom call from the lands of the Shasta and the Tacoma people. And I am sitting in my office, and it has a green wall behind me, and behind me is a Timokoro poster that I framed like it was the original painting. And that's because I need some of her power.
Thanks, Nataki. I mentioned the visual description because I also forgot it. So Chinese American glasses sitting in front of a glass sliding door in an otherwise white room. Dawn, Madeline, do you want to?
I'll just add, I'm a caramel complected Black woman. I'm sitting in front of a white wall. I have dark hair pulled back, and I'm wearing a dark navy blouse.
I am sitting in a very boring looking white room. I am to describe my face. I am a Mohegan Jew combo with very straight, long brown hair, the hooked nose of my ancestors, and too big of a smile.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, this is like what I like to model is I like to model imperfection at the beginning of these things because that's a thing that we're going to embrace for the next 90 minutes. A quick shout out, as I said earlier, to Norma and Jennifer, and also to Leanne Dow and Isabel Saragusa, who are working behind the scenes to make this evening possible. Yes, okay. So let me give a little bit of framing for this evening's conversation. I'm going to just tell the story that I've been thinking about a lot, which is like, it's a love story. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm like a complete, and I'm a stupid romantic. I had a girlfriend many years ago. I was thinking a little bit about this evening's conversation, and it brought me to thinking about my girlfriend from many, many years ago. And specifically like this notion that she and I would have like these regular arguments, right? And the arguments essentially revolved around this idea that love should be easy or love should be work. And just every argument kind of like ultimately came back to that kind of basic idea where from her point of view, love should not require work, that love should come like just with just ease. And I think I always came at this from the point of view that if you really love something, that you need to kind of work at it to make it the best thing that it could be. And so I've been thinking a lot about that in Shakespeare because I sort of like, so Cal Shakes, one of the things that we're wrestling with right now is sort of what does it mean to be a Shakespeare theater in this moment, in the midst of a revolution for Black and Indigenous liberation. What does it mean to be a Shakespeare theater committed to anti-racism? What does it mean to be a Shakespeare theater committed to the dismantling of white supremacy? And how do I reconcile the thing that drew me to this place in the first place, which is an opportunity to sort of linger in the words of this playwright and to tell these stories that I grew up reading. And the experiences that I've had since arriving here, which are complicated and complex, and maybe we'll get into in a little bit. But the question that I wanted to start us all off with, which is a simple one, I'm all for simple questions, which is in honoring that love story. Can I ask just when each of you, fell in love with Shakespeare? Marcus, you're muted.
Yes, I'll start. This is Marcus Gardley, poet playwright speaking. So I didn't love Shakespeare initially because in high school we were forced to see Shakespearean plays, and it became quite evident to me from the beginning that it felt like an experience that was supposed to be enjoyed by wealthy white people, and it gave them the opportunity to laugh at really smart things that there was no way I could know what these people were talking about. So it felt like an exercise for these people to laugh at humor and jokes and sigh and cry at moments that I did not understand. And so I thought this feels very intellectual and it feels very not for me or my community. And so I started to hate the work and really hate the plays. And then in college, I was a theater major at San Francisco State. And there was this really incredible professor named Mohammed Kauser, who I got to his class and I wanted to just do the Greeks because I grew up in the church and the Greeks was the closest thing to church. And I just loved the Greeks. You know, they were very dramatic and they liked to kill people. And I thought, this is for me. And I just liked the pathos and everything about the Greeks. And I just kept doing Greek work in his class. And he says, no, you need to do Shakespeare. He says, everybody has to struggle with Shakespeare. And I said, I hate Shakespeare. I said, everybody's drunk to Shakespearean Kool-Aid, but I will not drink it. And he says, you got to do Shakespeare. Otherwise you won't be able to graduate this class. So I said, okay, I'm going to really mess with this guy. I'm going to do Othello because I know that's what he wants. And then so I did Othello and I directed it and played Othello. And what I did was I cast a Black person as both Othello and Iago. And I was trying to toy with the notion of that. What if this man what if the Iago was like his alter ego or his subconscious, and this really was him grappling with race, his own race, and torturing himself and being paranoid. And the joy that I got out of that moment was I realized Shakespeare is flexible. What I realized is that the language is malleable, and the language, if you activate it right, because of the actor's power of intention, which is, I think, I always say is the most powerful thing in the theater. Like an actor, if you intend for a word to mean it, it will mean it when we watch it live. And that power that I was able to access with all this dense poetry by playing those parts, I thought, oh, I misjudged this guy. And I love the way those words felt in my body and how they came out of my body. It felt very, I felt like it was of my time and of another time. And that was a really beautiful experience for me. But then I started to grapple intellectually with the work, because now that I performed it, which is a different experience, I started to grapple intellectually with it. And so I recently wrote an adaptation, a very close adaptation of King Lear. And because I'm now dealing with unfortunately, my dad is suffering from Alzheimer's, and, Lear obviously suffering with, one can argue, the same kind of illness, it had a really powerful emotional impact on my life. And I felt like that play helped me understand how to have this new relationship with my father who has this illness. And so I still don't feel like I ever fell in love with Shakespeare, but I feel like we're dating, if that makes sense. And I believe in the power of his words, but I've had to disassociate that from the men, if that makes sense.
I'm happy to jump in because so much of what Marcus says resonates. Maddie and I have been talking about Shakespeare the full duration of the Shelter in Place. So Maddie, I'm sorry if any of this bores you to pieces. Like Marcus, I sort of grew up hating Shakespeare because it was forced on me. I grew up in Berkeley. I went to a high school that had a Black Studies department. So I was like a real militant Black. And I was like, this is for white people. This language is inaccessible. And I really just didn't enjoy it, and it didn't make sense that we were privileging it over so many other things that we could be studying, learning, and doing. But I say now that Shakespeare and I are on a trial separation because I did fall in love with Shakespeare, but we are going through a little something right now. I could tell you very specifically, it was the summer of 1998. I was 20 years old. I was doing the summer training congress at ACT in San Francisco. And my acting teacher was Tommy Gomez. Maybe some longtime Cal Shakes patrons would be familiar with Tommy. And he cast me in this scene where I was playing a Black woman who had lost her child to the system and had a white savior lawyer. And I had an existential crisis and said, is this all I'll ever play? Are these the kind of roles? Is this it? And he said, well, have you ever considered Shakespeare? And I was like, nah. And Tommy hit me with the facts. He was like, more actors of color are employed in Shakespeare and musical comedies a year than anything else. And so I don't know if that statistic has changed much in the 20-something years, but that definitely got my ears perking. And he said, we're going to do Shakespeare this summer. He said, you should start with the comedies. So I started that summer reading through the canon. I did start with the comedies because they were easier to understand. And Tommy cast me as Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I went ham. And I was like, this is the hardest I've ever had to work as an actor. I had to really dissect the text. I had to really embody the text. None of my acting habits that made me like a superstar in high school worked. I was like, scansion, what is it? And it just became so important to me. Because it was something that was really muscular. And so even when I made a switch from acting to directing, I became very passionate about Shakespeare. I think like Marcus talked about the Greeks, and as a director, I started doing the Greeks too, because it was very polyphonic. I love poetry, second to Marcus Gardley, Shakespeare is my favorite playwright. And so I became obsessed with it, like a real obsession. I even spent many years as an earlier career director branding myself because I knew that there would be gatekeepers who wouldn't hire me to direct Shakespeare if I hadn't somehow demonstrated my competency to do so. Marcus was on the faculty at my grad school. He knows I begged them to let me do a Shakespeare for my thesis, because if I don't do it here, I'll never get to do it. And it's still true that the like phone calls I get as a director are always for Black authored works, which I love that too. I'm not mad at that. But the Shakespeare work, I have to still kind of hunt. And of late, I have decided to like just not hunt it. So yeah, I desperately in love with Shakespeare, so much that on one arm it says, "If music be the food of love, play on." And on the other arm, it says "Non sans droit," which is the motto on the Shakespeare family crest. That means not without right. My platform for a very long time has been that Shakespeare is my birthright. And I could happy to say more about that as the conversation progresses.
I'll jump in. I almost wanted to be John, like, but what about that other tattoo? So I fell in love with Shakespeare when I was 7 years old. He was my first love. My mom started taking us to see outdoor Shakespeare in a park near us, and my grandfather immediately, like when he found out this happened, he bought me the complete works. And I was 7, so like I wasn't like, there are rules of Shakespeare, you know. I was like, oh, some stories that I can compare to some other stories. And I also, my mom was really into the fact that of continuously taking me, because what happened was the very first time that I went, I started explaining the plot to the people next to me, because like they were like, I don't know what's going on. And I was like, it was comedy of errors. So like as a little kid, actually, there's a lot of reasons why comedy of errors would be very clear. But I started explaining it. She was like, oh, this could be useful at some point. But the real reason I was actually showing up to the park to watch Shakespeare was because my mom made this like really good tuna macaroni in a jar. And I was really into that tuna macaroni salad. And so at the time, like, I was developing this like deep love of Shakespeare that was really because I just wanted tuna macaroni salad in a jar. But little did I know that this would have this huge impact on my life. So I started performing outdoor Shakespeare when I was like 14. And so a lot of how I kind of found myself when I was growing up was through Shakespeare. There wasn't like other people who I could like hang out with at school and talk to about other aspects of myself, right? I wasn't gonna go and like bond with people about Mohican culture or the things that like I was raised with. Instead, I was like at that point very in conflict with those things that were not normalized. And like Shakespeare was the thing that I could like connect with other people about. And so literally to the point where like, I like felt like when I spoke his words, like I had words suddenly. And like all of my first relationships were literally like doing Romeo and Juliet and then being like, now I am in love. Like it was very much like structured in a way where all of my early like sense of self and love, and to the point where I was very much, I would say, one of those bardolatry people where I was like, Shakespeare is clearly the answer to some things. It has come very far in another direction since then, because at that point I didn't have any of the tools to actually analyze what it was I was being handed. I was just comparing these stories to my traditional Mohegan stories, seeing the comparison, seeing the characters that are similar, thinking like, oh, this is something that has some things that have some commonalities in them. It wasn't until, the very first time I tried to direct a play though, every one of the first 2 times I tried to direct a play, for some reason it kept being The Tempest, which is so stereotypical, like it like makes me cringe now. But the first time I just remember, because I had been like grappling with The Tempest weirdly for the first time in college in a way, you know, that was like making me very upset about all the ways that I had encountered The Tempest as a child. And my proposal was that I wanted to do a version of The Tempest inspired by Jack D. Forbes' book, The American Discovery of Europe, which documents the first Native Americans who go over there and I was like, we're gonna do it the other way around. And they're like, well, but there's no other Native students here. And I was like, I see the flaw in this problem, in this situation. So I guess I can't direct that. And so then like a few years later, I was still grappling with it. And the first show I ever directed was a production of The Tempest that focused on the question, what would happen if Caliban could get his language back? Because I was very, very focused on the fact that this play was being removed from the context of actually what the sort of realities of colonialism were in America and are in America. And that set me on a very long journey that I will not talk anymore about right now. But yeah, I fell in love early.
I can jump in because I fell in love early too, Madeline. I was 8 years old when my mom introduced me to Shakespeare, but it was because she was upset that I had been listening to rap music in my room, because we couldn't listen to rap music even if I tried to, like right now, if I tried to turn something on my phone, because she's like in her room sleep right now as we speak, she would wake up and come in here like, turn that off right now. So when I was 8, I was in my room, and I'm about to age myself, with a boombox, and I had it like pressed up against my ear like this, thinking I was slick. And then she couldn't hear Salt and Pepper's Push It. So I'm in my room like, like getting it in, like doing all the moves, thinking I was cute. And then I heard a knock at the door, and it was like, a mama knock, real firm. And I answered the door, and she was standing there looking like my scary mama, because I knew I had done something wrong. And she had this big smelly book in her hands, and it was the complete works. And it smelled like an attic, because we used to keep a bunch of books in the attic of our house. And she handed it to me and told me if I like lyrics so much, I had to read this book. And I opened it like, what is this? Like I loved theater and everything, because I, by that time, had fallen madly in love with theater. She would take me to a theater in Detroit called The Fisher, but I had never seen anything like this weird book from some guy named Shakespeare. But I had to finish it because my mother is adamant about doing the things that she says, especially when I was a kid. So it took me 8 years, but she made sure that I finished the complete works from cover to cover. And by the time, if you've been reading something for 8 years, you might as well find a way to enjoy it. And so I started to enjoy it and learn it, and fell madly, deeply in love with Shakespeare. And at one point, it became a respite for me, because I'm from a block in Detroit called 7 Mile, and not the nice suburban part of 7 Mile, because 7 Mile runs long, but I'm from a part of the city that, especially in the 90s, was having a rough time. A lot of people that I grew up with were getting pregnant, or they were dead or dying. And so I would read books like Tolkien or Shakespeare and get lost and just get out of my own head. So in many ways, it was just a way to get off the block. I didn't really want to see anything or read anything that looked like what I already had to see every day. And then I started Shakespeare in Detroit years later, because I was a stand-up comedian living in Las Vegas, and went to the Utah Shakespeare Festival. And I figured if they could do that in the desert, then I could start a Shakespeare company in Detroit, where we have all these parks and stuff. So I started a Shakespeare company. Me and Shakespeare, we were still like this, madly, deeply in love, making out and stuff. We still really liked each other. And 5 years into Shakespeare in Detroit's journey, I got a cover of a magazine, and people were happy for me, except a lot of the white members of the theater community in Detroit. And so there was a post, sort of a live feed of 90 people kind of going off about this Black girl from the hood who got a magazine cover, and what does she know about Shakespeare, and who does she think she is? We've been doing Shakespeare for years. And so I told my mama, like, I'm not going to do this anymore, because the voice of Shakespeare has always been in my mother's voice, because she gave it to me, but then it started to get clouded by all of these white voices, and it wasn't as appealing as it had been for all those years. And so we fell out of love, and I got divorced from him for a while, until I got a fellowship at OSF. And during my time there, I met Dawn, and I met so many other people who reignited my love, my interest, and my passion for my friend William. And we've been in love again until this current pandemic. And I'm a caregiver for 2 very ill parents, which has taught me my capacity for really loving people, because I'm on the hands-on, feet on the ground caregiver 24/7. And I realized that I have such great capacity for loving people and for doing things. Maybe my capacity as an artist is greater than Shakespeare. I don't know yet. I'm still he and I are still kind of going through it and, you know, talking to a counselor. So I'll stop there. That's where we are.
Yes, Sam. Yes. Yes, I love the evocation of capacity and the sort of clarification of, you know, as you start to learn what that is. Because I think my story is sort of seated in that idea about capacity. So I also went to the same high school that Monique Williams went to, and I went to a junior high before that, Willard Junior High, and some teacher in the 8th grade or 7th grade taught us Romeo and Juliet, and I don't know if it was love. It was more like, you know, she was like, you can respond to this in any way you want. And you know, we had to watch the Italian filmmaker film version of it, and then read the play. And she didn't teach us anything about all the things you need to know as an actor. It was really just about, like, you know, let's just read this book, and here's a book report you have to write. And I performed Mercutio's Queen Mab speech for my 7th or 8th grade class. And it was like, I think the first time where I was like, oh, this feels like, my instincts were like, oh, I like this, but not like it represents me, or I didn't know anything about it. She was actually one of those really special teachers that didn't tell you that it wasn't for you. Didn't, you know, if you didn't understand it, she just sort of sat down with you and sort of helped you understand it, or gave you the logic, like, well, what do you think it means? And, you know, all those things that you need in order to feel like you can be successful at the thing that you're doing. And so I never felt unsuccessful at Shakespeare when I was in the 8th or 7th grade. It was actually when I got to Berkeley High that I felt unsuccessful. I had given up other avenues of performance, and settled on theater in a way, and was doing Taming of the Shrew. And I remember, I won't even say her name because you shouldn't speak ill of the dead. But I remember this teacher saying to me, oh, you know, this is probably not for you. That's probably why, you know, she couldn't get me to where she needed me to go. So as Kate, so it must have been because of something I was doing. And that was sort of the moment where I was like, sure, I'll swallow that pill. It's not for me. And I think, you know, like at some point, you know, I made a decision. I wasn't an actor. I moved into directing, and the bulk of my career has been in working on plays by Black people, and for Black people in white spaces. And adjacent to that was always this idea, like, you know, that I wanted to work on Shakespeare. I've produced Shakespeare, but I haven't actually had a chance to direct Shakespeare. When I was in grad school, though, when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for my thesis, I actually chose something because it wasn't Shakespeare. I did The Duchess of Malfi because it wasn't Shakespeare, because the power of that prose and the sort of the imprint of that on me, and how I felt about, you know, the sort of, you know, I kind of like the dank plays where people are terrible to each other. And that was a play that was really exciting to me in a way that the other Jacobean dramas were not, especially the Shakespeare ones. And so I rejected the notion that I had to do, I was like, I don't have to do this Shakespeare stuff. I knew I had to do something that was in line with the power dynamic, because I had to have something on my resume as I graduated from grad school that said, you are capable of doing that. So it's interesting, because I really feel like my love of Shakespeare is embedded in language. And I think it's because of that initial introduction, like this idea of the language, and that I could sort of get lost in the language, because words are, you know, words don't necessarily have to be qualified in all the ways. If you could just get to the word in a space of freedom and actually locate an intersection of freedom, you can find freedom in those words. You know, anything can be twisted in the way that you need that you want it to be twisted, but I was always looking for freedom in language. And so Shakespeare always has offered me kind of a freedom in language. So I'm not sure if I'm in love yet. I love Shakespeare, like, you know, like I love ice cream, you know, and I love a good conversation. And I love connection with humans, you know, and so I I don't love or hate, you know, I just sort of like, yeah, Shakespeare, cool, you know. And so running this theater that is sort of ensconced in this idea of Shakespeare, what I love is the opportunity to really unpack, you know, the voice of and the language, you know, for a new generation and with a new generation of people. I'm really excited about that.
So amazing. Thank you all. You know, I've been thinking as I've been listening to you all about this notion of invitation, right? And that, you know, that you mentioned Nataki a little bit, sort of like, I can't imagine that any one of us hasn't been confronted at some point with somebody saying to us, I don't think this is for you, in regards to this work. And I wonder about like this notion of belonging, and whether or not for you there's any like, is there any sort of resonance between Shakespeare and belonging? And I don't want to go much further than that. I'm just going to kind of like toss that into this space.
Can I say something about that? Because I feel
Yeah,
like
please.
I was just sitting here thinking, and I had to write it down because I was like, don't lose this thought, that there are no definitive Black female characters in Shakespeare. And so I was like, yeah, that's this, what is that? You know, like, what does it mean? Like, there are definitive Black male characters in Shakespeare, but as a Black woman, as you're trying to locate yourself, there's nothing that says that I exist, you know, like, so I don't know about if I belong there, you know, like I don't, or you know, if I should allow for the absence of me to dictate whether or not I do belong, you know.
I think for me, it had been the absence of me for so long that I allowed to dictate that I should belong. Because I feel like I fought so hard for it. I mean, that's why I got a tattoo that's like, no, this is my birthright. Um, and because I didn't necessarily see myself reflected in the work as a character. And I, in fact, had a teacher in my undergrad tell me, oh, you won't be able to do Shakespeare because you have an African American accent. I didn't even know what that meant because I'm from the Bay and we don't have an accent. but also, but also when you
Hella.
grow up, when you know, I growing up and constantly having people be like, oh, you sound white, or you're so square. So then to have somebody counter that with a like, well, you have an African American accent, was just like such conflicting information. So I fought for it because I was like, no, I'm going to make it mine. I'm going to make it mine. And then my sort of existential crisis with it began over the last handful of years with the Audre Lorde quote, really about you can't, I'm grossly paraphrasing, but that you can't tear down the master's house with the master's tools. And that has really stuck with me in terms of the work I'm trying to do as a radically inclusive theater maker, and feeling like, am I really just trying to, you know, make a square peg fit in a round hole? And I don't have the answer. And what ultimately made me say I just need to take a time out is that the majority of artistic directors that I am hired to work with are white men. And every time I am doing a Shakespeare play and I want to add Beyonce, I want to add a little Drake, I want to add 80s pop, whatever it is, whatever the cultural markers I want to add, I'm called to task about that every single time. Like, I lack the authority to do that. And I don't have that problem working for the same white men when I'm directing a Black authored play. So that has made me feel of late that I can take all of the skills that I have developed being somebody so devoted to Shakespeare, and just do other writers, because antithesis is still there and onomatopoeia is still there and rich language is still there. I mean, have you done a Marcus Gardley play, Eric? I know you have, right? Like, all, like, it's that heightened language, that rich poetic diction. There are Luis Alfaro, Susan Lord, there are other writers. There just are. And I don't have to give up my passion for language and metaphor. And I don't have to give up that part of my like integrity or dignity, because I'm constantly being called to carpet by these gatekeepers who don't know my cultural background and for some reason don't think that it's applicable to a Shakespeare play. So that sense of belonging is the exact like crisis point I'm in right now, Eric, because I love these plays so profoundly, but I feel tired of fighting or begging or having to justify. I'm like, I'll do other plays. I'll just do other plays, and I will be okay.
That's it. Oh, go ahead, Madeline. Go ahead. No, I was just gonna say I echo what Dawn said. You know, I can do other plays. Thinking of just belonging, I belong to my community, and I have intentionally and strategically and thoughtfully stayed in Detroit for a reason, because I belong to my community here. And in the last 8 months, I've been contemplating whether or not I am truly, speaking of being a caregiver, caregiving my community by telling the stories that matter to them, that amplify them, that empower them, that inspire them. These are working class people, those invisible. I'm doing A Midsummer Night's Dream soon, and my fairies are now factory workers, because I see the toll that factory work has taken on my Oberon, my king, my father. And so, you know, I'm in a place now, much like Dawn, where I realize that there are other things that I can direct. And being in the Blackest city in the nation, it is my responsibility as a member of this community to ensure that I am doing a intentional job, the same intention that I have when I care for the two people that I love the most, with my community in the city that I love so very much. And I can direct other plays. Yeah.
So at the very beginning, I just want to say, like, I was so indoctrinated into the idea that Shakespeare has to be all things that I believed The Tempest was anti-colonial. Like 100%, I was like, Shakespeare he thinks colonialism is bad. Like I was like, he must, for he is all things, and therefore, like, he must believe colonialism. That must just be what he thinks. And so, like, I literally went through The Tempest to try and prove this, right? And the first production I did, like, yes, I was able to prove it, but obviously there were extra textual interventions. It was the exact text, but there was a prologue in Mohegan that set it up as a story of something that had happened a long time ago, and then they leave, like they do at the end of the play. And it was just, it's interesting to me now, like, how much of my belonging in Shakespeare is something that I made up, or because there were no other places for me to belong. Like, I didn't find out there were Native playwrights until my last year of undergrad. You know, like, no one tells you that there are Native playwrights. You can't go to the bookstore and, like, buy a Native play. You're given Shakespeare. That's what you're given. And I remember the first time, like, I actually worked on a Native play was, like, after I finished my undergrad. And I just remember suddenly, like, being, like, amazed that there could be that many levels of connection in a story to, like, what your actual experience was. Because until then, it was Shakespeare, or, like, worse, like, you get to college and they're like, here, you can't have Shakespeare anymore, here's some Mammoth. And I'm like, now I really don't know what to do. So I just, like, I'm constantly torn with this, because for a long time I feel like so much of my sense of belonging was around the fact that, like, Shakespeare acts as a kind of fan fiction. Like, it's like a thing that a lot of people know about. You can both totally disagree about, like, what Hamlet or Rosalind would do, but, like, you can talk about it because, like, you both know the characters. And so what that meant over time was that eventually, once I left sort of my bubble of creating my own work, the expectations of who I was supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be in the field is just a lot of people wanted me to talk about The Tempest. Like, everybody just wants to talk about The Tempest. They don't even want me to direct The Tempest. They just want to come over and be like, can we talk about The Tempest? And I'm like, if this is a canon in which my identity is literally limited to The Tempest, like, we have some serious issues. Because, like, let's be real, like, that's not even really an Indigenous, like technically Caliban is a refugee, like, in a much more complicated situation, but, like, sure, let's talk about The Tempest. And so, like, that, I mean, I also went to do a PhD in the UK, and sort of that, like, that space of being like, I can write about other things. No, we really want you to write about the Native. Like, that's really the thing you should be writing about. You should be writing about the Native in Shakespeare. You should be writing about, like, the Native, like, as if that is also a whole separate other thing. And so what I realized was that the further I went into the Shakespeare system, the smaller I became, because they needed me to be only one thing, because they actually never saw me as belonging in the first place. What they wanted me to be there for was very different than what I was seeking. And so, like, you know, these great experiences I had, you know, like working with an all-native Shakespeare ensemble, then you turn around to the Shakespeare community and they're like, that's so innovative that you decided to put Native people in Shakespeare. And here I am, like, why would I imagine a world where I didn't exist? And so, yeah, so my relationship to belonging is very complicated, I think, because of the ways that this country has used Shakespeare as a weapon, which isn't the same as it being a playwright, right? The fact that, like, you know, Native people were stolen from our homes, forced into schools where we're then taught to learn Shakespeare, and our languages are taken away, means that Shakespeare is not something I really chose. It's something that I was given. And so, yeah, that was a long rant, but we complicate it now. We're complicated.
Yeah, I agree with everyone is saying. I think I find that, you know, I take issue with this whole notion of the purity of Shakespeare and Shakespeare needs to be done this way. For me, like these notions are the quickest way to actually kill the work and kill what it stands for. That actually, if people really did Shakespeare the way it was originally intended, it would be all men. It would be gesturing. It wouldn't be like what we consider acting, and it'd be all these weird gestures, and nobody would be able to stomach it because it would be boring, and it'd be the contemporary mind wouldn't even be able to like deal with that. And then people also forget that Shakespeare, what actually gave it value during its time is that it actually spoke to all the classes. That's what he's really best at. That he actually managed to speak to people from various classes. Now, did he do an excellent job at that? I mean, that can be argued, but the fact that he actually knew they were going to come and spoke to them at different class levels, I think is remarkable. I think, and so that's to me what gives him value. What also gives Shakespeare value is this notion of the living word, that words are living things, right? That words, they change over time, they mean different things. You can do something to a word and it can change its meaning on the spot. And the fact that he has such a vast array of plays, and because the plays are huge and because they speak to the human condition in profound ways, this is what makes the work great. But it's actually when artists challenge Shakespeare that actually breathes new life into Shakespeare. It's actually the throwing his words up against the wall and wrestling with it is actually what gives it new life. And that if people really wanted to sort of invest and celebrate this notion of what it means to be Shakespearean, then they would actually not only fund, invest, and celebrate playwrights, they would encourage playwrights to write huge plays. That if you wrote a play with 20 characters or 20 actors, you would say, great, we're continuing the legacy of Shakespeare. That what's killing Shakespeare now is everybody saying write 2 plays and literally a kitchen sink. That's what's destroying the American theater, and it's what's destroying this notion of what it means to be Shakespearean. That actually a writer should be encouraged to, as Dawn said, how to write with the muscularity of language and create worlds in which you are creating language, right? Unfortunately, why I ended up, and I still write plays, but when I started writing for TV is I felt like I come from a huge family, and I always felt like I was chained to write these small places when we live in a global world and a global society, and everybody's writing about mama on the couch. It's just, it's sinful. And that those people who call themselves Shakespearean purists and those who people believe in the vitality and the intellectual prowess of Shakespeare should actually take all of their money and invest in a young or bold and ambitious playwright. That's how you keep Shakespeare alive.
Thank you, Marcus. Hey, can we just so I want to take that a little bit, take that baton, Marcus, and I wanted you to use the phrase resisting Shakespeare, but that's okay. But I think what's interesting about this, what you're talking about, right, is that we're talking about Shakespeare, I think a little bit as an antagonist, right, in this. I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to frame with this series. And you had mentioned something earlier, Madeline, about Shakespeare as a weapon. And I wonder if we could I wonder if we could just delve into that a little bit, right? Like, so and I want to open this to not just like our personal journeys with this work, but also maybe our understandings of something larger. Like, I think that as a classical theater, as a Shakespeare theater, part of our job is to see things through the lens of history. And I love, so I want to invite that as well into this space. Like, what do you mean, Madeline? I'll start with you if that's okay. Is like, what do you mean about Shakespeare as a weapon?
Sure. There are a lot of ways Shakespeare has been used as a tool to uphold white supremacy. That is true. I mean, whether or not I like Shakespeare is irrelevant to that, because what has happened is that, we know that he's the only named author in the American Common Core. We know that means they can teach other people, but we know that you will be taught Shakespeare. That is the thing, you will be taught. And your relationship to that language is also determining your success in other avenues. He's being taught as the greatest playwright of all time often, right? So if you're comparing everything else to him, then the model in which plays are supposed to be formed are in the image of this white man who was writing in a time more than 400 years ago. So this idea that he's neutral, that he's not sexist and racist, is also being maintained. There were periods in American history where Shakespeare wasn't allowed to be performed, but was used as morality pamphlets. Can you imagine like Othello or Merchant of Venice as morality pamphlets? Like any playwright would lose their friggin' mind if they found out their play had been turned into morality pamphlets. Like, that's a whole separate thing. But the ways in which like the language has actually not been used, there's like rules around it, right? Like, the reason why I think I actually like Shakespeare so much is because I was 6 years old and wasn't like I was like, language, whatever, la 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 language. Like, there's things happening. It wasn't like there are rules to this language, you have to do the scansion and like blah blah. No, it was like, what does it mean to you, right? And it's these constructions around hierarchies, around Shakespeare as supreme, as this thing that is supposed to be above, that literally led me to be one of those bardolatry kids, right? Like, at a certain point where I was like, he must mean everything because he's not a man, he's a whole. I mean, there are people who think there was no Shakespeare, but there's like all these other people who were Shakespeare. Like, if you read the plays, like, they're not dramaturgically so great that you should really think that this man didn't write these plays. Like, I mean, like, why would you think that? It's crazy. And we know he was collaborating with other people. Like, there's a lot of things we know that makes sense. Like, you can read his canon and see dramaturgical innovations happening. Like, they don't mean he's not sexist and racist. They mean he's figuring out how to write more interesting plays. Like, I'm sorry, I'm a long rambler. It's not a helpful way of communicating in these Zoom formats, but it's just to say that the ways in which he is being used to uphold certain systems and being used to make people think that he's for everyone are actually not true and are actually confining us in different ways that we're not even aware of. I mean, even the fact that I had to hit a point as an actor where I said, I refuse to play any of Shakespeare's women. Because, like, I will go in and I will play you some Dromios and some Lucios and some Trantios. I will play you some of those fools. But I don't want to, like, die because I'm not a virgin. Like, that doesn't seem like the way that I want to spend my life. So that's my rant on Shakespeare as a weapon. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline.
I think it's also important to say that it was used as a tool for eugenics. Like, so as Europe, but in particular England, proliferated its imperialistic design across the world, it used Shakespeare as a way to determine whether or not this particular culture was going to be able to be infiltrated or is amenable to these ideas of being colonized or like, so I think it has been weaponized in terms of how you genocide, massacres, and the annihilation of culture across the globe. And so it's not innocuous. Here where I am, I have people who say, I just got up out of a conversation just before this one, in which somebody was like, when are we going back to the Elizabethan style of Shakespeare? And what they're really asking for is like a time where, so that sort of like It's a Small World, where they sort of shrink you down and put you in that little tube. And then you go into this world in which you don't actually have to be effective or think or be responsible for the impact of what's happening in the language, or what it means to your children, or what it means to the people who, what it means to the land you're on, what it means to any of it, right? You can just be like, oh, Shakespeare Parade, And so in that way, it's also been weaponized, because there's a way in which Shakespeare Festival Renaissance style pumpkin pants is it's like, this is what we all aspire to be. We're all from this. We've all risen from the ground as the sort of pumpkin pants notion of what Shakespeare is, as opposed to I feel like that's why I feel like I'm pretty lucky about the way I was taught it, but I also am like, I'm so clear that you can turn any book into a weapon, and like, it doesn't matter what it is, you can turn Oh, the Places Will Go into a weapon. If you really want to do it, you can do it. It's actually easy to do it. If you go back to the guy who wrote it, I'm sure there's something embedded in that writing that lets you know that it actually was probably a weapon. But and I think the same is true of Shakespeare. It is a kind of Bible for a literary Bible for how you determine somebody's worth. And that, I think, is probably the most problematic. Now, in this, to be concurrent to this idea of resisting Shakespeare, I'm always really curious about, like, how would I weaponize Shakespeare? Like, if I actually had, if the power dynamic was in my favor, could I use that gigantic book that Sam White's mama handed her to stop her from listening to Push It? Like, could I use that book as a way to wield something? And then what could I do with it? Like, what is the impact of that book from if it's my source? Do I have the same kind of power, or do I literally have to be white and male in order to empower it as a weapon? Because weapons could be used for good and evil.
And this is the thing that I felt like I tried for so long to sort of weaponize it in a way, I'd probably call it like subversion, in a way where it's like, yes, we're going to cast women in all these roles. We're going to cast people of color in all these roles. We're going to have these characters be non-binary. We're going to do all female Shakespeare, like whatever it was, to sort of just like flip it on its head. And then the resistance that I was met with as a generative artist in that way is what just made me kind of weary. Maddie and I have talked about this so much, that we continue to weaponize Shakespeare. We have all these Shakespeare in prison programs, and I love Shakespeare, but to take Shakespeare into a place where people are completely disenfranchised, they are no longer counted as citizens, and say that the only artistic outlet you get is Shakespeare. I'm like, look, I'm great if it's catharsis. I've watched the documentaries. A lot of these incarcerated people, they have a positive response, and that's great, but it wasn't their choice. And that concerns me, that we sort of lord Shakespeare as the one thing that we are going to offer to incarcerated people who don't get the right to vote. Many don't get to see their families. Many spend 23 hours a day in a box. That's a problem for me. Also, when you hear how Marcus was first engaging with Shakespeare as a student, that we sort of tell students that if they can't rise to this, there's something wrong with them. That's a problem for me, because what we all know now at this point in our careers is that punctuation means nothing. They made it up. Shakespeare invented words. That's no different than E40. That's no different than rap music. But we will let these young people think that they are defective if these plays don't make sense to them. And that disgusts me. And so I always try to have a radical approach that was like, no, I'm going to put them back. I'm going to put those people that feel disempowered by the work, I'm going to put them center of the work. But I just felt like in trying to do that, so many people wanted to deny me my cultural authority. So I just, it's like I'm throwing up my, I don't know. And I hope to continue to have conversations like this with people who I deeply, deeply admire, because I don't want to give up on Shakespeare at like a sentence level. The words on the page are so delicious to me, but trying to do the work in the American theater, it's exhausting.
Yeah, and I just, what Dawn said just resonated with me, because these are things that I've contemplated in my journal the past 8 months, just amongst myself, which is why I'm just so happy to have this conversation with everyone. The history and the weaponizing of Shakespeare in academia, and right now, to make ends meet, I'm working with students in primary and school, and they're required to read Shakespeare. You're required to read it, Romeo and Juliet 9th grade, Julius Caesar 10th grade, and I think it's Mackers and King Lear. And one of the first things that one of the 9th graders asked me is, "Hey, Miss Sam, is this proper English?" You know, and that just kind of like, it stabbed me in my gut, because we spent 2 weeks after having started the prologue of Romeo and Juliet with me then explaining how African-American vernacular, or how we speak as Black people, at least here in the Midwest, with a little bit of Southern twang and whatever else we put on top of it, is just part of the survival that slaves so magnificently were able to do, learning a language that was not theirs, but a language that was forced upon them, and adding a little bit of, you know, of their own nuance to it to survive, and maybe they didn't want someone else to know the plans to escape, etc. And now, because it's so institutionalized and students are required to read it, Black students, because again, Detroit is 84% Black, they've been taught by teachers who, by the way, there's most of the, I think it's 60 or 70% of English teachers in Detroit public schools are white, have been told that this is proper English, and their native tongue, which again is Southern roots like Alabama, Mississippi, is incorrect English, and Shakespeare is the proper way that a Black kid should speak. And so I'm sitting and contemplating currently, and every night for the past 8 months, if the work that I had been doing in Detroit, where I thought that I was kind of flipping Shakespeare on its head, doing these cool things. Shylock was Black, Romeo and Juliet were Black. We did Much Ado About Nada. We were doing all this work that I was so proud of, but now having had a 14-year-old Black kid come up to me and question their own language and their own identity makes me question a lot of the things that I've been doing for the past 8 seasons. So I have a lot more journaling to do and thinking, yeah.
Yeah, I love what everybody is saying. And I would just like to add that I feel like, you know, I think one of the most dangerous things about white supremacy is that it's predictable. And I think when we force or weaponize Shakespeare on our young people, or young people of color in schools, the young people have Shakespeare because they have Biggie, they have Tupac, they have Jay, they have Shakespeare. They, trust me, they know they do. They have the Shakespeares of our times. The Shakespeare of our times are literally writing for them. So Shakespeare was never compared. But what happens is we bring Shakespeare to the community, to their communities. And then if a student says, "Oh, the play was great, it changed me," or if a student writes about it in a profound way, that student, because he or she knows how white supremacy works, it's doing that because it's how you get celebrated, right? And the danger of that is it sends this message that that actually this whiteness, which Shakespeare is, right? This whiteness, see how it can heal these Black people? See how it can make them feel better about themselves? When, trust me, it's not doing that. That if people are having an experience in which they are seeing them, so like I described my father, it's actually just the power of language. It's not this man, it's the power of language, right? And the things that language can do. And it's really also the power of those theater makers. That's really where the credit is due. And I think that in this moment, because we're at a precipice of a great moment of real change in our country and in our world, we should start calling these things out and acknowledge them as facts. Fact number one, Shakespeare never wrote an African-American woman or a Black woman, sorry. Shakespeare never wrote a Black woman in 37 plays. That's 37 chances to write the great ancestor. The great ancestor means we all came from a Black woman's womb. So you never wrote Black woman in 37 plays and we all descend from a Black woman, you are a racist. That's what facts. You are a racist. Done. Okay, let's move on past that. So we acknowledge him as a racist. You didn't cast any women in your plays, you are a misogynist. These are facts, right? There's no way to argue that. These are facts. And so I think we should lay these things out and acknowledge him and take him down from the pedestal of moral high ground. He does not belong there. Right? And we should put people there who belong there. And we should take these characters. Cleopatra is a Black woman. These are facts. And we should say Cleopatra is a Black woman. And someone should write a Cleopatra play, which they have done, about Black women. They should take Aaron down and say, okay, this is the Aaron that you wrote. Well, this is my Aaron who loves his Blackness, who loves his son. This is your Othello. This is my Othello, who actually this is not his story. He rose above that. Like we have to we have to acknowledge that these are artifacts in history, take them as they are, and then we have to be in dialogue, in conversation with them by writing our own stories. That, again, is the way Shakespeare, when we grapple with Shakespeare, again, this is the way I think the work can stay alive in a real way. You know, I just experienced, OSF did this really remarkable thing where they had playwrights do translations of what we're calling them, but they're kind of like translations or adaptations, whichever you prefer. But basically, we took all of the plays and did a modern translation of them. And there was such a, I would call it violent backlash because the purity of Shakespeare by people from all walks of life. And I thought to myself, as a playwright, I would be rolling in my graves constantly if people did not challenge my work. That if people 50, 100 years from now didn't go, you know what, he's kind of misogynist here. You know what, he's kind of homophobic here. You know what, that's what it means to be an artist. We don't always get it right. That's what makes us human. You should challenge it and grapple with it. And that's what makes Shakespeare great. And I hope 20 years from now, somebody does like some terrible mime, I shouldn't call it terrible, but some mime version of one of my plays, you know, getting at the root of what he's talking about. This is what keeps art alive. And I think, again, I'll say it 1,000 times, wrestling with Shakespeare is the best thing anybody could ever do for him.
So, yes. Yeah, I was going to ask you this question about like, I was going to ask a question about reconciliation, but I don't know that there's anything in reconciliation that actually gets us any closer to what you're talking about, Marcus, and what you're talking about, which is like, actually, maybe it's in the wrestling. It's actually in the resistance that we start to really unpack and reveal. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Okay. So I'm just doing a little time check. We technically have 15 minutes left in our conversation here. And there was I had this list of questions that I wanted to, there's a couple questions that I really wanted to get at, but I'm not sure, can I ask you a question? I'm going to just ask this, and again, I'm floating a question out there. Don't everyone feel like you have to answer it. And I'm curious to see if it leads to other questions, right? But so in this conversation about reconciliation, I think I am going to ask it, but only insofar as we are a Shakespeare theater, and because Cal Shakes is a Shakespeare theater, OSF is a Shakespeare theater, right? Shakespeare in Detroit is a Shakespeare theater. I mean, it's in our name, so therefore I think kind of how do we own that? I guess my question a little bit has to do with sort of, there's all this conversation in the field right now about how our cultural arts institutions can be anti-racist in their practices. And this is the question that I'm going to just pose, which is, can a Shakespeare theater ever truly be an anti-racist organization?
Well, so my very pat answer is no. But what it can be is an organization that continually strives through the evolutionary practice of becoming more and more and more and more and more anti-racist. But I think here's another question: is the act of theatering and the sort of westernized sort of version of what theater is. Is it possible to destroy that construct, right? Because if it can destroy that construct, then you can create this space that is opposite of that construct, and that construct is embedded in white supremacy. It's created for it's the white Western theater practice is white supremacist from Jump Street. I think that it's funny because I'm historical in my I got this appointment and everything, and it's supposed to sort of prove that OSF is sort of at the end of this conversation about racism. And actually the interesting thing about entering where you and I have entered into these Shakespearean theaters is that it's actually at the very beginning of the conversation, and everything before that is the groundwork for that conversation. And really the battles that were fought to lay that groundwork so so that people like you and me can be in these positions. Like, so we're still dealing with aftermath first before we can even talk about anti-racism. So, and I mean, and that's in the staff, and that's in the board, and that's in the work on the stage, and that's in like, how do you do Mary Catherine Nengel's play about the genocide and actual ripping of land from a group of people, and then also do the plays about manifest destiny across the street from each other at the same exact time, you know, like, so and then be like, yes, you know, this is the beginning of our anti-racist practices. So I feel like I don't think that organizations like ours become sort of reach the pinnacle of anti-racism. I don't think there's ever like a destination where you go like, we're not racist anymore, right? I think what you have to do is continually evolve this conversation about what it means to be anti-racist and embed it in every single part of your operation, right? And then in next year, you have to go back and evolve that operation, right? Because this is the system that created it was just as tedious. It was just as like it was like at the nucleus of the cell that create, like the cell structure has it. So you have to build cell structure, and then you have to do it again, and then you have to do it again, and then you have to be like, oh, not quite there, do it again. And then I think for like the next 500 years, you have to do that. And then maybe you might dismantle what created the space, and then you might be able to start the practice of becoming anti-racist. But you can't do it unless it's dismantled. And I think that's 500 years out. I'm gonna do my part while I'm here, but I think it's 500 years from now. And that means that, like, in order for me to guarantee that thing happens in 500 years, I have to really do my part, right? I can't sleep on it.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Nataki, about, oh.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, I agree. We've been doing a little bit of an introduction to a new name at Shakespeare in Detroit, because I feel that it's my responsibility as a Black woman who was introduced to Shakespeare by a Black woman in this Black city to change our name. And so we've slowly been changing the name on some of the swag that we put out in the world for Shakespeare in Detroit. It no longer says Shakespeare in Detroit, it says the new classic now. Just to get people used to not saying Shakespeare in Detroit anymore. And I was talking to you a little bit about that the other day, about just, you know, thinking more deeply about the way that we position ourselves in this particular city at Shakespeare in Detroit. And I'm a founder, which means, and breaking news, I probably only have 3 to 5 more years as the artistic director here at Shakespeare in Detroit. So myself and the board have already started thinking about, because founder syndrome is real, by the way, we've started thinking about who the next artistic director is. And she is a Black woman. And so it's my responsibility, before she takes over this company, to ensure that I create a foundation that is not perpetuating white supremacy and white patriarchy. And that means that we have to make a total shift in the language that we use, whether it's what we present on our website, whether people are walking around rocking Shakespeare in Detroit t-shirts, because even those two names, Shakespeare and Detroit, do not complement one another. I was wrong 8 years ago. And so can a Shakespeare company be anti-racist? Not completely. And as Nataki said, 500 years, just years and years and years of implementing new systems that uplift all people, right? But for me, as a founder who knows that she won't be around for, longer than 5 years, we have, and that name change means it's not just simply changing the name on our website or our t-shirts, it's changing the way that we present ourselves to the world and making sure, going back to belonging, that we truly belong in a community that's 84% Black. And we cannot do that with a white man's name being the first name in our company's name.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing that. I'm thinking a little bit about history, and I'm thinking about the kind of like the tempo of of centuries, right? Nataki used 5 centuries, right? Like, so it's going to take as long, right? Kind of this, like, it's going to take as long as it took to get us here to get to where it is that you're talking about. And I'm 100% behind you. Like, I 100% agree with that, right? Like, this is, so this notion of time, right? Because it feels like so much of where we are right now is in this space of urgency. Like, we lose sense of, like, we feel like we don't have enough time. It always feels like there isn't enough time. And I'm wondering, how do we move through this question of this moment? Because I, like, part of the urgency that I'm feeling from like all different corners is the sense that in this moment in time where we are, right, that the only way forward is to relinquish a name, is to let go of this thing. But what I'm also simultaneously aware of, right, is the sense of urgency that's behind that. It's like, it has to happen now. And how do we be in both places? How do we be in both places? Like, how do we hold both things? Like, how do we hold the urgency of what is being asked of so many of us in this moment of reflection, in this moment of accountability, and also, and maybe there's no answer to this, but and also, right? Like, hold on to this thing that we have this complicated relationship with, right? How do we resist the simple choice? How do you resist the simple choice? And this is gonna probably carry us to the end of this conversation. So I dropped this question into the room. You all are, by the way, I'm just so grateful for you. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question on your question?
Please.
Yeah, because I think my question is like, how do you resist the simple choice? How many simple choices do you make in order to make a collective complex choice? Do you know what I mean? Like, one step is like the visibility of, you know, what Sam was talking about, the visibility of the word Shakespeare. And then like, there are like all the other steps that are behind that led to that, right? And then that is one of a series of complex shifts that have to happen in order for, I mean, that's what I'm understanding. So is, my question is, maybe it's a question statement. It's like, is it simple to change the name, or is that the complex, you know, to sort of dismantle that part? And then there's another complex. That's what I mean. Like, I feel like,
oh yeah,
there's so many steps. It's like, you know, and I'm a process person. I like 500 steps. You know, as long as I know that I get to, you know, revel in the joy and the angst of the 500. Right? If I know that I'm a part of a process to lead someplace. So yeah, question in your question.
I think for me right now, I'm just holding space for myself. The action is the inaction. For the first time in 8 seasons, actually thinking about my next season. I'll confess, when I think about seasons, I'll sit with our production manager and I'll sit with a couple of volunteers and other people from the community, and I'll go, okay, this show makes sense for fall. This show makes sense for winter. We'll do this in the summer. Oh yeah, we'll throw this in here too, because that one will make money, you know, to support the free show. That has been the process for me in creating seasons. But for the first time in a long time, unfortunately, due to a pandemic, the action has been taking a thoughtful pause about what we present to the world whenever we're able to come back and present to people and have them in a theater or outdoors in a park, sitting next to one another safely. And I had to, I think with that name change, oh, that was hard to do, because we had printed so many T-shirts and mugs and all of these things. But I'm like Nataki, like I'm a process person. So I had to have one step that would kind of be a guiding light in whatever direction I take when this pandemic is over. And that light was to start by introducing a new name to the theater company, and then allowing that kind of creating the space, but then allowing things and more action to follow that one unique step. And also, again, just leaning into the inaction of the moment, the thoughtful pause that we're able to take right now at Shakespeare in Detroit.
I don't have an answer, but I do have like a thought that in many ways, I sort of throw back, Eric, to you and Nataki. One, I was at OSF during the last strategic planning process, where part of that work was leaning very heavily into Shakespeare as our middle name. Shakespeare is our namesake playwright. So I don't know Nataki as like a new leader who kind of inherits this plan midstream, where any sort of feeling of fidelity lies to that embracing of that whole branding of Shakespeare as our middle name. And Eric, I heard many times, like rumored, right, that your predecessor would have very quickly gotten rid of the Shakespeare in the name, had the opportunity presented itself. But now, as we're in this moment, I think none of us will come back the same, right? So any strategic plan that happened before 2020, even if it was only in year 2 of a 5-year or year 5 of a 10-year, like it's all like we have to come back brand new. So so I just kind of throw it back to you that like, what is the value of Shakespeare as a namesake playwright for anybody? But to be honest, and I mean, it used to be a goal of mine that I want to be artistic director at a Shakespeare theater, and I completely let that go. Like, I work at a theater that we don't even produce Shakespeare. Not that we never will, but it's not like the thing we do. And I knew that when I took the job that I was kind of like putting that on the back burner. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but it's just you two as like executive leadership at these big theaters. That
Eric, did you want to be the artistic director of a Shakespeare theater? I never was like, the Shakespeare theaters, but so.
Well, this kid from Oakland did.
Yeah.
No.
I have a tiny thing. It doesn't answer anything. It's just something I've been thinking about for the last 5 minutes, and so I'm just going to share it, which is that at Carlisle Indian School, Pennsylvania, the one of the sort of huge boarding schools that the Native students were stolen and taken to, and that their mission was to kill the Indian and save the man. There was a student who, when forced to give up their name, chose Will Shakespeare. And I don't know why, but I think about this. I mean, I do know why, but I think about this all the time, right? This kid who was told that their name couldn't be their name anymore, and they chose the name Will Shakespeare. But the thing that I even think about more for some reason is that the spelling that it was in on that document was Will Shakespeare. And this is like got me all caught up for like months, right? Like about the like, is the issue the urgency of taking something and trying to make it something else, or is there something in the wrestling and the subversion that is still relevant? And I don't know, because I mean I do recognize that doing things in an urgent way, right, leads to the same kind of horrible colonial practices as taking someone's name away. But at the same time, that name is replacing so many other things right now and pushing them aside. So I don't have an answer, right? I also recognize that there's the problematic nature of it as a brand, which is that, the Shakespeare brand is like, you put it on anything and it makes money. And so I have no answer, but for some reason I keep thinking about that boy.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that I have with Shakespeare is that as an institution, right, is that it's become synonymous with the theater. That it's hard for people to decipher, for a lot of people to decipher the difference between Shakespeare and the theater, because they're told that Shakespeare is the highest form of theater. Well, the problem with this is there's a lot of people who wouldn't readily see a Shakespeare play. This plays don't speak to them. it's dated, and what have you. And these people who live in these communities where these theaters are don't have actually access to stories that actually are engaging to them. And that's what makes Shakespeare dangerous. That actually, why is Shakespeare synonymous with the theater? That to me is the dangerous idea. That wouldn't, I don't know if it's the taking of the name away. I mean, you know, that maybe is more of a conversation for artistic leadership. But I often, when we started this conversation with a beautiful way, several artists acknowledges the land that they were on. And I think we should start acknowledging the land that we're on and the places where we are. And there should be places named after that for people who have died. Innocent people have died on these lands. And why can't we acknowledge and symbolize them? You know, why can't we, as a form of bringing people together, as a way of bringing people together and starting a healing process? I really embrace both Nataki and Eric's notion of these 500 years, because every time I talk to people about race, which I end up doing quite often, everybody forgets that this is 500 years of oppression, 400 years of slavery and oppression, or forms of slavery and oppression. So everybody wants, oh, Obama's president, we're done. You know, a lot of people think like that, you know, and we have 500 years. It's 400 years of oppression. It takes at least 500 years just to breathe, just to really go, okay. You know what I mean? So we are nowhere near that. And if we can acknowledge that, and if the United States can acknowledge the crimes and the pain that they have enacted on humanity, then we can now start to lay the foundation of healing for all of us. We all want healing in our communities. And I think this notion of naming is a very powerful thing, because I always argue that words are the most powerful thing in the world, right? Words can disarm a war, right? People go to war because they miscommunicate. So words are extremely powerful. And when you acknowledge people that have come before us and ideas that have come before us and the pain that communities have suffered that came before us, when you do that, you literally begin the healing process. And theater, when it's really at its highest peak, it is dangerous, it is sexy, it is revolutionary, it is spiritual, it's doing all of these things. And I think in this moment, we have a really, really great opportunity to look at our past and look at our future and start naming it. We can name the vision that we want to see, and we can acknowledge the past that we have ignored for so long. I get emotional, sorry. We can acknowledge the past that we have ignored for so long and give people their due. And that's the world that I want to live in.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to do this, but please don't take this the wrong way, because I just value like book ending things. So I'm going to take a moment and to come back to that girlfriend that I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. And when we finally broke up, a bit of advice that came from a dear friend. And what she told me was that it takes 3 times as long as the relationship to heal from it. But the first thing that you got to do is you got to want to heal. Everyone, thank you. Thank you for this extraordinary conversation. I want to thank Jennifer and Norma for the magic that you do. There will be a resource email that will follow with resources. If our panelists have resources that they want to share with you, but things that were named here this evening, we will include those in the email. Our next direct address in Resisting Shakespeare is going to be an artist roundtable featuring initially the panelists from our very brief-lived mystery Shakespeare Theater 1592. We're going to talk a little bit about why we stopped that when we did. And we're going to be inviting a lot of Cal Shakes artists to join us on this screen and at this table for this conversation. So keep an eye out for that. I'm just going to share one last picture with you all, because I think this is where we started the day. Not here exactly, This is where I started this evening. I don't know if you can see this. That's my daughter. She's a pair of the feet that were running around upstairs at the top of this conversation. That's her in her Halloween costume last year. Friends, I got so much fear. I got so much fear right now, but I am grateful in the knowledge that we are traveling together. I say that also to all of you that have joined us here this evening. Thank you for coming out. And I think we've got a little music to take us out.